You'll understand. That's what human resources said while sliding the printed compensation letter across the cheap laminate table in that windowless room. One line on that paper told me everything I needed to know about how the company really worked. Principal infrastructure architect, 15 years of experience. Compensation aligned with 2026 internal equity guidelines. Internal equity, apparently, meant I was being paid significantly less than a junior analyst I had personally trained. Same department, fewer responsibilities, no production ownership, no incident history, but she had the right credentials, the right schools, and a resume that looked impressive in investor decks. Accept it or leave, the HR partner repeated, eyes fixed on the checklist in front of her instead of on me. Her name was Monica Feldman. She looked exhausted in the way people do when they know they're delivering bad decisions they didn't make. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't mention the compliance failures I'd quietly prevented or the outages that never made it into quarterly reports because I fixed them before anyone noticed. I reached into my folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, my resignation letter. I choose leave, I said, signing it calmly, effective immediately. Monica stiffened. Elise, you don't have to decide right now. You can talk to your manager. We can revisit this. No, I said. You just explained exactly how the company values my work. I believe you. At 12:46 p.m., my badge was deactivated. At 12:51, my system access was revoked. At 1:14, I was walking through the lobby carrying my laptop, a coffee mug, and the notebook that mattered more than both my personal incident log. By 1:30, the first alert fired. I didn't see it from inside the building. I saw it the same way customers did through the public status page: elevated error rates, payment delays, engineers investigating. Normally, this is where I would have stepped in, but I wasn't on call anymore. By 2:30, executives were asking who owned the failing pipeline. By 3 p.m., my name was everywhere, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I explain how quietly walking away turned me into the most expensive absence in the company's history, if you enjoy stories where people who actually understand systems stop protecting those who don't, subscribe. You won't want to miss what happened before midnight. My name is Elise Parker. I'm 46 years old. I've spent most of my adult life making sure complex systems didn't fail at the worst possible moment. I didn't come up through prestige programs or leadership tracks. No Ivy League crest on my resume. My degree came from a state university most recruiters skim past unless they're actually reading. Before that, I spent 4 years working operational infrastructure for a defense contractor long nights. No margin for error. Systems that didn't care how tired you were or how well your manager liked you. Either the system stayed up or everything downstream failed. That mindset never left me. I joined Northbridge Solutions 14 years ago, back when it was still founder-run and obsessed with reliability. The company sold itself as a platform for enterprise continuity. What that meant in practice was that banks, healthcare networks, and retail payment processors relied on us to keep transactions flowing. When we went down, money stopped moving, regulators noticed, lawyers followed. I started as a senior systems engineer. I didn't try to stand out, I just made myself useful. I took on-call rotations no one wanted. I handled the incidents that didn't have clean root causes. I learned every undocumented dependency, every fragile service that just worked because no one had touched it in years. People started saying, "Ask Elise, she'll know." At first it was casual. Later, it became policy. I still remember the first major incident. I led a regional processing failure that hit 3 financial institutions on a Saturday night. Error rates climbing, latency spiking, millions at risk per hour. I found the issue in under 40 minutes, a silent retry loop tied to a legacy validation service no one remembered owning. I stabilized it before customers noticed. The founder sent me a one-line message. Good catch. That was the job. Fix the problem so no one had to explain it. Over the years, My title changed just enough to avoid triggering compensation rebanding. Senior engineer, lead architect, principal architect. The work, however, stayed the same. I built the incident response playbooks, designed the monitoring dashboards, wrote the runbooks junior engineers used when things broke at 3 in the morning. I documented everything, not because I planned to leave, but because systems teach you patterns if you pay attention. What fails first? What fails quietly? What warnings get ignored? Then Northbridge modernized. A new CEO, a new CFO, a new people operations team. They talked about scalability, optimization, and constantly internal equity. Leadership tracks appeared overnight. Brand name resumes arrived. People who spoke fluently about risk but had never carried it. I stayed where I was. Still the one paged at 2:13 a.m. Still the one quietly fixing things. Until the company decided I was too expensive for what I represented. And that's when they learned the difference between knowing how something works and assuming someone else always will. I wasn't inside the building when the first system failed. I was sitting in my car in the parking structure, engine off, refreshing the public status page on my phone. Old habit. Even after my access was revoked. Some part of me still expected to see something break. The first banner appeared quietly. Investigating elevated error rates in transaction processing services. Neutral language. Carefully chosen. The kind of phrasing meant to buy time. I knew that pattern. Error rates climbing without a dramatic spike in latency usually meant something was backing up in silence. A queue filling. A service retrying too politely. The sort of failure that looks manageable until it suddenly isn't. Normally, I'd already be inside the incident channel pulling metrics, comparing historical graphs, narrowing down suspects. I'd built the dashboards myself. I knew which ones told the truth and which ones softened it. But my Slack account was gone. The banner updated, identified issue in the payment orchestration layer. Engineers actively investigating. Payment orchestration was vague enough to calm executives while buying engineers a few more minutes. It also happened to include a legacy idempotency service I had flagged repeatedly as fragile. Each time, the response had been the same. Next quarter, the banner shifted again. Degraded performance. Some customers may be unable to complete transactions. That was when real money started slipping through cracks no one could patch quickly. Failed checkouts, hung authorizations, partial settlements. The kind of problems that don't stay internal for long. My phone buzzed. A message from Mark Ellison, one of the senior engineers still inside. You seeing this? I didn't respond. Another message followed. Leadership's asking who owns the pipeline. Your name came up. Of course it did. Ownership at Northbridge was never formal. No one wanted their name attached to risk, until risk demanded a name. The status page turned red. Major outage. Transaction processing unavailable for a significant number of customers. Significant was legal's word. The threshold where notifications went out and explanations started getting rehearsed. I flipped the phone face down. Movement caught my eye. Someone running across the lot. Arms waving, shoes skidding slightly on concrete. I recognized her immediately. Natalie Cho, the CEO's executive assistant. Always calm, always controlled, not running. She reached my car. Breathless. Elise, please, she said. They need you upstairs. Payments are failing globally. The board is asking for you by name. I looked at her. Then at the building I no longer had access to. I don't work here anymore, I said evenly. Her voice dropped. Just an hour, consulting. We'll make it worth your time. I shook my head. This isn't about money, I said. This is what happens when warnings are treated as optional. I put the car in reverse, behind me. The status page refreshed, still red. I wasn't in the room, but I know exactly how it unfolded. Northbridge's executive conference room had glass walls and expensive chairs designed to project transparency while keeping real conversations contained. When the outage crossed from technical issue into business event, Every familiar face assembled quickly. The CEO, Richard Halverson, opened with practiced calm. He always did. Calm, to him, was a signal of authority. "We have a production incident affecting transaction processing," he said. "I need clarity. What failed? And why wasn't it anticipated?" The head of engineering spoke next. Calvin Moore, a recent hire with a polished resume and an impressive vocabulary. He talked about unexpected interactions, rare edge cases, and teams working around the clock. No one interrupted him at first. Then the CFO asked the only question that mattered. Who owns the pipeline? Silence. Ownership, when written down, creates accountability. Northbridge avoided that whenever possible. Titles were fluid. Responsibility was shared. But outages don't respect organizational ambiguity. Eventually, someone said my name. "Elise Parker built most of the orchestration layer," Calvin admitted. "She documented it. She flagged some risks." The CEO frowned. Flagged how? In design reviews, incident retrospectives, risk summaries. "And where is she now?" Another pause. "She resigned," said Monica Feldman from HR. Her voice was quiet, effective immediately. The CEO's tone sharpened. "Resigned today." Monica nodded. "After the compensation review." The CFO leaned forward. "What adjustment did we offer her? 2%. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone exhaled sharply. 2%, the CFO repeated. "To the person who owns our most critical system." Calvin tried to recover. "We have other engineers familiar with the system." "Familiar," the CFO said, "is not the same as accountable." Legal finally spoke. "Do we have current runbooks? Partial." Calvin answered. "Some dependencies were undocumented. Undocumented wasn't accurate. They were documented in my notes, my logs, my warnings. They just weren't prioritized." The CEO rubbed his temples. "Can we bring her back? Short-term consulting? I already tried," said Natalie Cho. She declined, said any engagement would have to go through her new employer. The room went still. Her new employer. "How long has she had another offer?" the CEO asked. No one answered, because no one had thought to ask. The CFO closed his laptop. "We're losing revenue with every failed transaction. Customers are escalating. Regulators won't be far behind." Calvin swallowed. "We can attempt a restart sequence." Attempt legal echoed. "It's complex," he said. "Order matters." The CEO finally asked the question no one wanted to answer. "Does anyone here know the correct order?" No one spoke. Outside that glass room, engineers were working furiously. Inside it, the cost of a single decision was becoming impossible to ignore. And the company was about to learn something it should have learned years ago. Systems don't fail randomly. They fail exactly where they were warned they would. From the outside, it looked like progress. The status page shifted from red to orange. Language softened. Phrases like partial recovery and mitigation in progress appeared, carefully chosen to reassure customers without promising stability. Inside, the system was unraveling. I know this because Mark kept texting short messages. Clipped. The way engineers communicate when they're running out of options. They restarted the orchestration service. Cache is behaving weird. We're seeing duplicate authorizations. That was predictable. The idempotency layer was never meant to be restarted casually. It relied on state carried across multiple services that assumed order assumptions that only held if you followed a specific sequence. I'd written that down more than once. Not in bold, not in slides, in plain language. Buried in runbooks no one had time to read. A restart without context doesn't reset a system, it scrambles it. Customers started reporting charges that didn't reconcile, payments that looked successful on one side and vanished on the other. Inventory systems lagged behind reality. Support queues filled with contradictions no script could resolve. Leadership saw graphs improving and assumed the danger had passed. It hadn't. The engineers did what they could. They throttled traffic, disabled retries, rolled back changes they didn't fully understand. Each step reduced one symptom while amplifying another. This is the part no one likes to admit. Complex systems don't reward urgency. They punish it. Another message from Mark. Legal's asking if this could trigger compliance review. Of course they were. Payment inconsistencies aren't just technical failures. They're audit magnets. Regulators don't care how hard you worked or how understaffed you were. They care about controls, documentation, and accountability. 3 things Northbridge had decided were optional. Someone suggested bringing in an external consulting firm, then another, then a third. Each came with impressive credentials and thick slide decks explaining failure modes I'd already mapped years earlier. None of them knew the system's history. They asked the wrong questions first. Which service owns this? Why was this built this way? Who approved this design? There were answers. They just weren't in the room. Eventually, the CEO authorized a direct call to me. Not through HR, not through legal, straight to my personal phone. I watched it ring, let it stop, watched it ring again. When I finally answered, his voice was tight, carefully controlled. "Elise," he said, "we're in a difficult situation. You created it," I replied. "We need your help. You told me to accept it or leave." A pause. Then, quieter. "Name your price." That was the moment I understood something clearly. They still thought this was a transaction. I told him the truth. "I don't want your money," I said. "I wanted you to listen before the system taught you the lesson itself." I ended the call. Behind them, the system kept failing in exactly the way it always would. The tone changed once money entered the conversation. Up until that point, the outage had been framed as a technical problem, something engineers could fix with enough time and caffeine. That illusion didn't survive the first wave of customer calls that reached the executive floor. Major clients weren't asking when things would be stable. They were asking whether transactions could be trusted at all, whether data had been corrupted, whether regulators had been notified. Those questions don't come from panic. They come from legal departments. Mark's messages shifted from technical fragments to something heavier. Finance is freaking out. Customer success pulled into emergency calls. Legal wants written assurances we can't give. Northbridge's contracts were clear. Downtime beyond certain thresholds triggered penalties. Inconsistent payment records triggered audits. Audits triggered disclosures. Disclosures triggered headlines. No one said that last part out loud, but everyone was thinking it. The CFO stopped asking for updates and started asking for numbers. Lost transactions, refund exposure, penalty ranges. He wanted totals, projections, worst-case scenarios. Numbers don't lie, and they don't care how inconvenient the truth is. That was when customers began to leave, not dramatically, not with angry emails, quietly, methodically. They paused integrations, reduced volume, asked competitors what migration would look like hypothetically. Competitors are always ready for hypotheticals. Legal drafted statements that said a lot without committing to anything. Engineering kept pushing patches that stabilized one subsystem while destabilizing another. Support agents followed scripts that hadn't been updated because no one knew what the truth was yet. This is the part where organizations fracture. People stop sharing information unless they're certain it won't be used against them. Decisions slow down. Every action requires approval. Every approval requires someone else to take responsibility. Responsibility is a scarce resource in moments like that. The CEO called again. This time, his voice wasn't controlled. "Elise, this is bigger than compensation. This affects hundreds of employees." "So did my work," I said. "For years." Silence. "We can revisit the equity decision," he said finally, retroactively. It was too late for that. Equity adjustments don't repair broken systems. They don't rewind decisions or restore trust. They don't put knowledge back where it was dismissed. "You're trying to fix the wrong problem," I told him. "This isn't about me anymore." After the call, I sat with that realization longer than I expected. I hadn't triggered anything. I hadn't sabotaged a line of code or withheld documentation. I had simply stopped absorbing risk for people who treated it as invisible. The system didn't fail because I left. It failed because it was built on the assumption that I never would. And now, for the first time, the company was seeing the true cost of that assumption itemized, documented, and escalating by the hour. The first customer didn't leave loudly. There was no angry press release, no dramatic post on social media, just a carefully worded email sent to Northbridge's executive inbox. Legal copied, subject line neutral to the point of cruelty. Notice of intent to suspend processing activities. It came from Havenport Financial, one of Northbridge's largest enterprise clients, a conservative institution, risk-averse, the kind of customer that didn't threaten unless they were already halfway out the door. Mark forwarded it to me with a single line. "This is bad." The message was polite, almost apologetic, due to unresolved inconsistencies in transaction reconciliation and concerns over operational controls. Havensport would be temporarily routing all new transaction volume through an alternate provider while conducting an internal review. Temporary was doing a lot of work there. Routing volume away wasn't a pause. It was muscle memory being retrained. Once customers learned their business could survive without you, they rarely forgot. Inside Northbridge, the reaction was immediate and chaotic. Sales wanted assurances they couldn't give. Customer success wanted scripts rewritten hourly. Legal wanted everyone to stop writing anything down. Engineering wanted clarity that no one was authorized to provide. Executives wanted to know one thing. Who else was thinking about leaving? The answer was uncomfortable. Everyone. Havenport's move didn't cause the crisis, it confirmed it. Other clients began asking pointed questions about audit trails, about redundancy, about what would happen if the core architect never returned. That phrase made its way into more than one email. Core architect. It hadn't appeared on my title. It hadn't appeared in my compensation band. But now it was the most accurate description anyone could offer. The CFO asked whether Havensport could be persuaded to stay. Legal said maybe if Northbridge could demonstrate stability, transparency, and a credible remediation plan. None of those things could be assembled quickly. The board demanded a call. Emergency, closed door, no slides. Someone finally asked whether my documentation could be used to reconstruct the system's logic. The answer was yes, but documentation doesn't replace intuition. It doesn't tell you which warning to ignore and which one means stop everything. It doesn't tell you when a system is lying to you politely. That knowledge lived in experience, and experience, once dismissed, doesn't wait around to be missed. Another customer followed Havensport, then another. Each departure made the next one easier. Less risk, more precedent. I watched it happen from a distance. I hadn't expected to feel so calm. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't angry. I was watching an organization collide with reality at full speed and realizing that nothing I could say now would change the outcome. Some failures can still be fixed. Others have already moved beyond that stage. Boards don't panic the way teams do. They don't raise their voices. They don't speculate. They ask questions slowly, and they expect answers that survive repetition. That was the problem. Northbridge's board convened an emergency session once it became clear the outage wasn't an anomaly and customer attrition wasn't theoretical. By then, the story had escaped internal channels. Industry analysts were asking why a company positioned as mission-critical couldn't explain its own failure modes. Inside the boardroom, the tone was clinical. What failed? Why it failed? Who knew it could fail? Why nothing changed? The CEO spoke first. He talked about growth pressures, modernization efforts, and an unfortunate convergence of events. He framed the situation as complex, emergent, and ultimately unforeseeable. The board listened. Then they asked for documentation, risk reviews, incident retrospectives, deferred remediation lists. That was when my name started appearing again, not as a missing resource, but as a recurring author. I'd flagged the same components more than once, not dramatically, not emotionally, just clearly, consistently, and with suggested fixes attached. Each time, the remediation had been deferred in favor of higher impact initiatives. One board member asked a question that shifted the room. "If this engineer identified the risk," she said, "why wasn't it addressed?" Another followed. "And why was she allowed to leave?" No one answered immediately. Eventually, HR explained the compensation framework: equity bands, market alignment, credential weighting. The language was familiar, polished, confident. The board didn't interrupt. When HR finished, one director leaned back and said something that landed harder than any accusation. "So we optimized for spreadsheets instead of systems." That was the moment the conversation changed. Attention moved away from the outage and toward the decisions that had made it inevitable. Who approved the compensation plan? Who signed off on deferring remediation? Who accepted the risk without understanding it? Responsibility, long diffused, began to condense. The CEO was asked whether he had personally reviewed the risk reports. He had not. The CFO was asked whether financial exposure from technical debt had been quantified. It had not. The head of engineering was asked whether there was a succession plan for critical knowledge holders. There was not. The board didn't yell, they didn't threaten. They asked for resignations, not immediately, not publicly, but the expectation was clear. The company hadn't just lost customers, it had lost credibility. Outside that room, people still believed this was about an outage. Inside it, the board understood something more dangerous had failed: the assumption that institutional knowledge could be treated as optional. I found out about the meeting later, secondhand. By then, the outcome was already set. Once boards start asking why, they don't stop until someone answers with their job. Public collapses are never honest. They're edited. Northbridge's announcement came early, before analysts could finish connecting dots. A carefully timed release framed the outage as an operational challenge that had been successfully mitigated, paired with a leadership update meant to signal stability. The CEO was stepping down to pursue other opportunities. The company thanked him for guiding Northbridge through a period of growth. No mention of deferred risks. No mention of warnings. No mention of why the outage happened when it did. Markets don't need truth. They need a narrative that holds long enough for the next quarter. Internally, the change was anything but smooth. Interim leaders arrived with mandates to restore confidence. Not necessarily understanding. Teams were reshuffled. Reporting lines redrawn. Committees formed to study what had already been documented. Engineers were asked to do two things at once: stabilize systems and reassure customers. Both required certainty. Neither was available. Clients noticed. Some accepted the explanation, others didn't. A few requested independent audits. A few more paused integrations indefinitely. Each pause was explained internally as temporary. Each one quietly reset expectations. The board approved a remediation roadmap. It included investments in documentation, redundancy, and knowledge continuity. The words were familiar because they mirrored the recommendations I'd made years earlier. This time, they were approved without debate. I watched from the outside as my former role was redefined. Not refilled, redefined. 3 people now covered what I had done alone, each specialized, each well-paid. Coordination meetings multiplied. Risk was finally visible. The CFO issued revised guidance. Revenue projections softened. Analysts adjusted models. The stock dipped, then dipped again, then stabilized at a lower altitude. Stability, apparently, was now the goal. A recruiter reached out to me during that period. She wanted to know if I'd consider returning as part of the new chapter. Advisory capacity, competitive compensation, a seat at the table. I declined. Not because the offer wasn't fair, but because the table only existed after it had already collapsed. What stayed with me wasn't the leadership change or the market reaction. It was the quiet rewriting of cause and effect. The implication that this had been unpredictable, that no one could have seen it coming. I could still picture the meeting with HR. The checklist. The phrase "you'll understand." They were right about one thing. I did understand. I understood that organizations often learn only when the cost becomes undeniable, when the story they tell themselves no longer survives contact with reality. Northbridge would continue. It would recover. It might even thrive again. But it would do so carrying a lesson it never wanted to pay for one. It had tried to discount until the bill arrived in full. I heard about midnight later, a message from Mark, sent hours after everything had gone quiet. They finally understand now. Northbridge's offices were still lit long past normal hours. Legal teams rewriting disclosures. Finance reconciling numbers that refused to line up. Engineers watching dashboards that no longer inspired confidence, only vigilance. Right before midnight, the board finalized what they called a retrospective correction. Compensation bands were adjusted, titles rewritten. A new role was created, one that closely resembled the responsibilities I'd carried for years. Now split across committees and approvals. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who had watched me walk out with a notebook and a laptop. But corrections don't rewind time. They don't stop customers from remembering the moment they lost trust. They don't erase the quiet realization that the system had worked only because someone had been absorbing risk without complaint. I never responded to the last email they sent, the one asking if I'd reconsider, if I'd help them transition responsibly. I already had. Transition, I'd learned, isn't something you negotiate after the fact. It's something you respect before it's forced on you. A few weeks later, I started my new role. Different company, different culture. Same work, but this time, visible, valued, properly compensated. Sometimes people ask if I regret leaving the way I did. I don't. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't sabotage systems. I didn't demand revenge. I simply stopped protecting people from the consequences of decisions they insisted on making. And right before midnight, when the numbers finally settled, when excuses ran out, when reality could no longer be deferred, they understood something they'd dismissed for years. Equity isn't what you write on paper. It's what you choose to value before the system makes the choice for you. I didn't walk away because I was angry. I walked away because I finally listened to what the system was telling me about my worth, my limits, and the quiet cost of staying silent too long. The real lesson wasn't about pay gaps or titles. It was about dignity, about how easily we get used to carrying responsibility that no one sees. Until one day, we realize we've been shrinking ourselves to keep everything else standing. If this were your story, would you change any detail, or have you lived a moment like this too? I'd really like to hear your story. Where are you listening from right now if this resonated with you? Please leave a comment. Like the video. Share it with someone who might need it, and consider subscribing. Sometimes, one story is enough to remind us we're not alone.